Hello and welcome to this talk on sleep in children with neurodevelopmental conditions. My name is Miriam Shabetai and I am a sleep researcher and sleep coach with a specialisation in neurodevelopmental conditions and intellectual disabilities. So who am I? On the screen now you'll be able to see varying different logos of places that I have worked both as a researcher but also as a support worker and as a sleep coach at the charity Advance at the bottom. But currently I am a first year PhD student working on the RESTED study, which is looking at exploring sleep in teenagers with a mild to moderate intellectual disability. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But over the course of this talk, we are going to cover what sleep is, why it's so important, and what it specifically looks like in Down syndrome. We'll then go on to kind of how we measure sleep, the management of sleep problems once you've found out what they are, and finally, a little summary of what my PhD is looking at and what it's hoping to achieve. So what is sleep? Sleep is an incredibly active time for our minds and bodies, in which individuals experience multiple cycles of 4 different sleep stages, categorized as non-REM, rapid eye movement sleep, and REM sleep. These distinct stages can be identified by differences in what our brain is doing, what our eye movement is doing, and our muscle tone. Throughout the night, the amount of time that we spend in each stage of the cycle changes, with rapid eye movement, REM sleep, dominating the latter third of a night's sleep. Typically, each cycle lasts about 90 minutes, with an experience of a brief arousal at the end of a cycle. These brief arousals only last a few seconds and they're often not remembered in the morning unless someone is taken into a full awakening. And you'll see from the diagram that as we go through the sleep stages, it becomes harder to wake and that each stage has a distinct use. There are 2 processes underlying sleep, process S and process C. Process S regulates the length and depth of an individual's sleep according to a buildup of sleep pressure. So the longer you go without sleep, the more you are driven to fall asleep. Process C refers to someone's circadian rhythm, this internal process of clock genes that determine the timing and duration of sleep and wake. And this is controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus that you can see in orange on the screen. Social cues like meal times and routines entrain our internal clock to a 24-hour cycle. And the most influential environmental cue is that of the light-dark cycle, which transmits circadian rhythms via the suprachiasmatic nucleus to the pineal gland in purple for the secretion of our hormone called melatonin. Overnight, as the individual sleeps, the pressure build-up from process S goes down, and the pineal gland stops secreting melatonin, and together this drives an individual to wake. Sleep is vital, and there is a plethora of research about how it impacts neurotypical people and people with neurodevelopmental conditions. And I could talk about the importance of sleep all day, but today I'm going to cover briefly 4 different aspects: cognition, physical health, mental health, and behaviour. Sleep is vital for some cognitive functions, particularly that of consolidating declarative and non-declarative memory. Short-term sleep restriction has been linked to poor performance in attention and executive functioning, and sleep duration is positively associated with overall academic achievement in school-age children. And sometimes I like to think of the brain as a bit of a sponge, and during the day, with all of our experiences and everything that we learn, it's like putting a sponge in a bowl of water. And overnight, that sponge is pressed dry. All of the water is removed and some of it has gone to long-term memory, some of it is forgotten. But it means the next day it's ready to be put into another bowl of water. But when we've got sleep restriction and we don't get enough sleep, the brain doesn't have enough time to effectively squeeze out all of that water. And so the next day, taking on more information is much harder. Sleep is a hugely important time for our physical health as well as our cognition, and can impact growth, our appetite, whether we have headaches, all sorts of things. So while we sleep, our growth hormone is secreted, which means that children who maybe don't get enough sleep can sometimes be seen as being quite short. And we often find that if we haven't had enough sleep, we tend to have different appetite the next day. So we may be craving more sugary, short-acting food. And when we're thinking about physical health, it's important to highlight that sleep really helps our hormones and our muscles to recover. So I like to think about Mo Farah, that kind of well-renowned athlete, who has a very rigid structure for both his training and his food, but also for his sleep. And that's because he knows that the sleep that he gets is really important for how his muscles recover and therefore the impact of his training. And so while sleep is really important for our cognition, it also impacts our body kind of physically. And as well as that idea of physical health, poor sleep really impacts our mental health. So poor sleep has been associated with negative mental health outcomes across people's ages. So insomnia, this idea of difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep, is a significant predictor of the development of depression, and changes in sleep architecture, so those stages we spoke about earlier, are highlighted in eating and personality disorders. If we look particularly at teenagers, sleep restriction, so this idea of not getting enough sleep, has been associated with increased levels of tensions and hostility, as well as difficulties when it comes to regulating and managing our emotions. Now, this is crucial when we're thinking particularly about children with neurodevelopmental conditions, because there is such a high prevalence of co-occurring mental health in this population that if we've got high levels of poor sleep and poor mental health, all of this is much worse when we're looking at children with neurodevelopmental conditions. And finally, let's look at the impact that sleep has on behaviour. So people who don't get enough sleep are often seen to be a little bit more impulsive. And we know that if we look at teenagers in particular, sleep deprivation is associated with increased risk-taking behaviour, such as dangerous driving and alcohol and drug use. And children with persistent short sleep are reported at school entry to have higher impulsivity and hyperactivity. And caregivers also report that short sleep duration is associated with child inattention, whilst teachers report more externalized behaviours such as conflict with others. And again, if we're looking at children with neurodevelopmental conditions, often impulsivity and hyperactivity are seen to be part of the neurodevelopmental condition. But it's important to note that actually these traits and these signs can often be because of poor sleep and not inherent to the neurodevelopmental condition. So we've briefly spoken through the cycles and the processes underlying sleep and the impact that sleep can have on individuals across a range of different areas. But now I'd like to focus particularly about what sleep looks like in people with Down syndrome. So one of the things we commonly see in children with neurodevelopmental conditions is something called sleep onset delay. This is when someone takes a long time to be able to fall asleep. So when they're in bed and they're actively trying to sleep, but it takes a long time for that to happen. Within Down syndrome specifically, we also see something called fragmented sleep, whereby the sleep cycle is regularly disrupted and cannot be maintained. This is often due to obstructive sleep apnea, which we will cover in a minute. Finally, due to difficulties initiating and maintaining sleep, we often see excessive daytime sleepiness. This is when someone seems excessively tired during the day. If a child does not disturb their caregiver overnight, daytime sleepiness can also be a good indicator of a sleep problem and always warrants further examination. So we know that 50 to 80% of people with Down syndrome experience obstructive sleep apnea, in which breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep. This causes the sleep fragmentation we mentioned earlier due to the brain waking the body up to get more oxygen and then the person falling instantly back asleep. But why is this so common in Down syndrome? So people with Down syndrome have craniofacial differences in which there are smaller nasal spaces and narrow airways, which get blocked during sleep. Furthermore, as we sleep, our muscles naturally relax. Within Down syndrome, low muscle tone means during this period of relaxation, the airway is more prone to collapse. Finally, we often see enlarged adenoids and tonsils in people with Down syndrome, and these can block the upper airway, making it harder for air to pass. And the first line of treatment of OSA is removal of tonsils and adenoids. And if this doesn't improve the symptoms, then CPAP machines, continuous positive airway pressure machines, can be used, which deliver pressurized air through a mask to keep the airway open during sleep. If you think your child may have OSA or you're concerned about some of the symptoms that we've spoken about, please do go and seek a medical professional's help who is involved in your child's care. So we've briefly covered what sleep looks like in people with Down syndrome and in other neurodevelopmental conditions, but how do we measure these sleep problems? So there are lots of different ways to measure sleep, but the gold standard is something called polysomnography. And polysomnography, as you can see from the images here, requires a lot of different wires. And that's because it measures a range of different things. And these include airflow, oxygen levels, heart rate, brain waves, eye movements, chest movements, snoring, and limb movements. And from this, we can estimate different stages of sleep that we mentioned earlier in the sleep cycle. Polysomnography also provides something called the apnea-hypopnea index, the AHI, and this is the number of breathing pauses per hour, which helps determine the severity of obstructive sleep apnea. So the higher that index, the more severe the OSA. Now we need polysomnography to measure and determine the severity of obstructive sleep apnea, but it often requires children sleeping in novel environments, in sleep labs, in hospitals, and sometimes at universities. And so you can also use home sleep apnea testing kits, and they don't require someone to sleep in a novel environment, and fewer wires are involved. But it doesn't monitor brain waves and therefore cannot do that sleep staging for the sleep cycle. And it also doesn't measure as many things as polysomnography, so the data that you get from it isn't as rich, but it's much more accessible for children who will not be able to sleep in a sleep lab overnight. A slightly more accessible means of measuring sleep is something called actigraphy, whereby someone wears an Acti watch, which you can see here, that records the light and movement levels. So it's worn continuously on someone's wrist or their ankle, and it takes the light and movement measures, and from this is a proxy measure of sleep. So it doesn't do all of the different things that polysomnography does, and it can't tell us anything about sleep stages or architecture, but it can give us a proxy measure of sleep, and it's much more accessible to those that may have sensory issues. And actigraphy is something that I use a lot in the research that I conduct, and I'll be using it throughout my PhD, because we've seen that children who have these sensory differences can become more accustomed to wearing a watch, given that it's over a longer period of time and it doesn't have as many wires and cables involved. And finally, the way in which we can measure sleep problems is using questionnaires. So research studies with neurotypical populations often use self-report questionnaires to gather information regarding specific symptoms with sleep disorders, such as the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index and the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. However, research with children relies on informant report measures, often completed by caregivers or sometimes even teachers. These questionnaires, like the Child Sleep Habits questionnaire on the screen, ask a range of different questions to understand a child's overnight behaviours as well as behaviours pre and post sleep. However, there is evidence of informant reports overestimating the amount of sleep and underestimating the amount of sleep a child may get. So sometimes caregivers can overestimate the amount of sleep their child is getting because caregivers are not being disturbed by their children overnight. So this is particularly relevant when we're thinking about teenagers who are later on in that developmental stage, who may have their own rooms and their own bedrooms, who may be awake overnight but aren't disturbing their caregivers. So caregivers are unaware. However, sometimes caregivers can also underestimate the amount of sleep that a child is getting, and this is often due to their own levels of sleep deprivation, and this will impact their ability to accurately report the amount of sleep the whole family is receiving. And so we've seen the ways in which we can measure sleep. You've got polysomnography, you've got actigraphy, and you have a range of different questionnaires. And we've also seen the impact that poor sleep can have. So it's really important that we put in strategies to manage sleep problems once they've been correctly identified. And we're now going to talk through different ways in which sleep problems can be managed. So the first line of sleep management is something called sleep hygiene. And these are a set of sleep-related behaviours that cue people towards sleep. They can be broadly categorised into 4 categories. So you've got environmental, so a dark, cold room. You've got scheduling, so the same bedtime and wake-up time. Sleep practices, like having a bedtime routine. And the physiological, so timing of meals and caffeine and chocolate consumption. And these practices work via behavioural conditioning, in which association between certain activities and environments are formed with successful sleep. So the more you do these behaviours and end up with successful sleep, the more likely these behaviours are going to cause successful sleep. On the screen, there are different examples of sleep hygiene practices. Firstly, we have journaling. This can be really helpful to get overwhelming and sometimes negative thoughts out of someone's mind before trying to fall asleep. But for children for whom written communication is hard, journaling does not have to be sat down with a pen and paper. It can be done through drawing or colouring and voice notes and videos and so much more. Next, this idea of a bedtime routine can be a fantastic way to build structure into an evening in the run-up to bed. By having a routine, your child is cued towards sleep, and this builds a strong association that these activities lead to sleep. A bedtime routine can have the necessary elements of bedtime, such as pajamas and brushing teeth, but also things that are relaxing and enjoyable for your child. These might be puzzles or colouring or Play-Doh. But sometimes our brains can just be a little bit too busy to fall asleep, and that is when listening to an audiobook or white noise can really help take the mind away from what is ruminating and these busy thoughts and allow someone to start to relax and fall asleep. But it can also be really helpful to describe the importance of sleep to your child. Sometimes sleep feels like a bit of a punishment when children are going to bed, because realistically, who wants to spend time alone in a dark room when they could be playing? And there are lots of helpful books and videos and podcasts about why sleep is so important, and this can encourage children to go to bed with a little less reluctancy. And relaxing activities that reduce stress before bedtime are vital, and these can include drawing, medication, breathing exercises, colouring, Play-Doh, the list goes on. But finally, it's really important that the environment for sleep is positive, making it a comfortable temperature with night lights or music if desired. And through trial and error, you can find the routines and the activities and the environment that works best for your child to really encourage and support sleep. Often, difficulties with sleep onset and sleep maintenance can be described using the operant model of reinforcement. When a child wakes at night, they are likely to display a signalling behaviour, such as crying, and this signalling behaviour is aversive to a caregiver. Therefore, a caregiver will respond to this behaviour by soothing, getting into bed with the child, or even reprimanding the child. Regardless of the caregiver response, this will be viewed as rewarding for the child. The child will then stop their signalling behaviour, which in turn is rewarding for the caregiver. Over time, if the signalling behaviour and the caregiver's response are the same, a mutual reinforcement cycle is formed. But it is important to note that this is a process of subconscious learning and there is no intention and manipulation behind this. Vitally, there is no fault. It is a behavioural process that develops over time. But using this model can be a really helpful start for improving sleep problems because we can use behavioural sleep interventions to gradually reduce the reinforcement a child receives when they wake at night, and ultimately they will begin to learn how to self-soothe. And by doing these gradually through sleep interventions, the child at no point feels threatened, their alert system is not tripped, but they are able to self-soothe and return to sleep independently. Whilst this model accounts for what happens once the child has woken, it does not explain why the child initially wakes. Now, there is evidence that this may be due to pain. So, research by Dr. Agar using video footage overnight of children with Angelman syndrome and Smith-Magenis syndrome showed that prior to overnight waking, children were displaying pain-related behaviours. Now, much more work is needed to further explore these reasons behind waiting, but it may be that within Down syndrome, this waking is caused by lack of oxygen due to obstructive sleep apnea. And so whilst the child is being woken up, the behavioural sleep interventions can only target what happens once they are awake. So when we were talking about the underlying processes of sleep, we mentioned that our naturally producing hormone melatonin is produced by the pineal gland as we sleep. Now, sometimes exogenous melatonin can be prescribed for children who have sleep problems, and this works by inducing drowsiness that encourages sleep onset. So it's particularly useful for children who struggle with that initial falling asleep. But work that I have conducted talking directly to caregivers has described melatonin as a little bit spiky. And there's this idea that for some children it works really well and for some doesn't make any difference at all. And again, if melatonin is something that you want more information about, it's something that you should talk to your medical doctor about and someone involved in the care of your child. If you are concerned that pain may be a factor influencing your child's sleep, then the FLAC pain scale is a really helpful way of measuring pain, particularly in pre-verbal children or those with limited verbal communication. And over a period of 10 minutes of natural play, you look at the face, the legs, the activity, the crying, and the consolability of a child, and rate each of those 5 items of 0, 1, and 2. And you can generate an overall score that indicates the likelihood of pain. And if you're interested in reading more about pain in children with neurodevelopmental conditions, or you want to access the FLAC pain scale, you can scan the QR code here. We've mentioned the impact that sleep can have on mental health and also the impact that mental health can have on sleep. And there are different ways in which mental health and mood can be measured in children with neurodevelopmental conditions and intellectual disabilities. The Intellectual Disability Mood Scale is a self-report measure that uses images of buckets to cover a range of different mood states and how much someone experiences them. And if you're concerned specifically about anxiety in your child, you can scan the QR code on the screen to access Cerebra's Anxiety Guide for further support. Now, we've spoken through the behavioural model and the way in which caregivers can use questionnaires to identify sleep problems. But what happens when children aren't signalling to their caregivers overnight and are sleeping in an environment that is separate from their caregiver? When they're then asked to describe their sleep, caregivers are going to be slightly less informed and therefore a little bit more inaccurate. And that is what my PhD is focusing on. So my research over the next couple of years is looking at developing an accurate sleep profile of sleep in teenagers with intellectual disabilities. So at the end of the 3-year period, I will have developed a new self-report sleep measure that teenagers with mild and moderate intellectual disabilities can complete by themselves with the support of their caregivers to give a more accurate profile of what their sleep looks like. We have covered a lot over this talk. We have looked at the sleep cycle and the different processes underlying sleep. We've covered why sleep is so important and the ways it can impact our cognition, physical health, mental health, and behaviour. We've also covered specific sleep problems with Down syndrome and looked at obstructive sleep apnea. Finally, we've covered different ways we can measure and begin to manage sleep problems. But on the screen now are the key takeaways from all of this information. Firstly, sleep is complicated. We've seen how there are different processes involved and different stages with their own unique use. From this, we discussed that sleep problems are not the same across individuals or neurodevelopmental conditions. We know that the way in which we measure sleep may not always be appropriate, with cables and wires for polysomnography and reliance on caregivers as children age for questionnaires. And it's important to note that while sleep hygiene and interventions work to improve sleep outcomes, it's vital that these are tailored to the individual and their specific sleep problems. And lastly, sleep is not isolated. Caregivers and other family members are impacted by an individual's poor sleep, and it's important to remember to be kind to yourself if your family is experiencing sleep problems. So, thank you so much for listening to this talk on sleep in children with neurodevelopmental conditions, and I hope you found it really interesting. If you would like to contact me, my email and phone number on the screen now. And if you'd like to be part of the research I'm currently conducting, please contact me or scan the QR code.